Walter Harland, a quiet veteran who served 2 tours in Vietnam, dedicated his retirement to meticulously tending a local war memorial, a sacred place honoring fallen soldiers. When the city council shockingly decided to demolish it for a skate park, a line was crossed. Walter, a man of profound duty, took a stand. Donning his faded army uniform for the first time in decades, he chained himself to the monument, his silent protest making headlines and drawing ridicule. Now in court, facing charges and dismissed as an outdated relic, the room is filled with sneers and disrespect. Will his silent resolve crumble, or is there more to this unassuming veteran than meets the eye? If Walter Harland's incredible story of courage and remembrance moved you, imagine the other powerful narratives we can uncover together. Support our mission to share these untold tales of real heroes. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future inspiring content. You dig that uniform out of a costume shop. A voice sneered from the back row as the old veterans stepped into the courtroom. Laughter followed quickly, cruel, careless. They saw the faded uniform, the rusted medals, the stiff walk, and decided he was a joke. No one stood. No one defended him. But then the judge opened her file. She read a name, and everything stopped. She rose from her seat, raised her hand in a formal military salute, and spoke 2 words that sent a chill through the room. Sergeant Harlon? In that moment, the people in that courtroom realized they weren't watching a trial. They were witnessing history. Walter Harland had been born in the spring of 1943 in a weathered farmhouse on the edge of Clay County, Kentucky. His childhood had been shaped by the cold, muddy waters of Coal Dust Creek and the steady rhythm of hard labor. As the youngest of 5 children, Walter learned early to carry more than his fair share, especially after his father died in a mining collapse when Walter was just 8 years old. His mother, tough as railroad spikes, worked tirelessly, taking in laundry, putting food on the table, and teaching her children a quiet grit that needed no explanation. Walter was a boy of few words. He listened to the rustling of the trees along the Appalachian hills, to the murmurs of old veterans sitting outside the general store, swapping stories about Normandy, Korea, and brothers who never came home. He never asked questions, but he remembered every word. By the time he turned 18, Walter had no clear path ahead, just a sense of debt to those voices from his childhood, the ones that haunted the porches of his youth. In 1961, he enlisted in the U.S. Army without looking back. Vietnam changed him, though he never spoke of it. He served 2 tours from 1966 to 1971 with the 25th Infantry Division. Walter never kept photographs from that time. There were no plaques on his wall, no flag folded in a shadow box. He never spoke of names, dates, or missions. But if you ever caught him on a quiet evening, sitting on the porch with a glass of sweet tea in hand, you might notice his eyes grow distant, staring past the horizon. It was there, in the jungles of Kang Tree and the rice paddies near the Cambodian border, that Walter became a man few in his town ever truly knew. He earned the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with a V for valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and half a dozen other commendations that most soldiers only dreamed about. Yet he came home with none of the swagger. He had only a limp and a silence that followed him like a shadow. After his discharge, Walter didn't chase promotions or political causes. He worked as a janitor, a groundskeeper, a handyman, whatever paid the bills without too much fuss. Eventually, he found long-term work maintaining the county's municipal buildings, the courthouse, the library, and the small civic theater. They all bore the unspoken mark of Walter Harland's quiet care. But there was one place he treated differently: Memorial Grove Park. At the center of the park stood a weather-worn stone monument etched with the names of every Clay County resident who had died in war since World War I. The lettering was faded, the base chipped, and the flagpole slightly askew. Still, Walter came every Saturday, even after retirement. He cleared leaves, trimmed the grandmas, cleaned bird droppings off the stone, and straightened the tiny American flags left by school children. He did it alone, never drawing attention. When asked why he kept returning, Walter would only shrug and say, "They kept their post. I figure I can keep mine." To Walter, that monument wasn't just a local relic. It was sacred ground, a final roll call of brothers, friends, and even strangers whose names meant more than the stones they were etched on. The park was quiet, often forgotten by the newer generations. But to him, every name was a memory kept alive by presence, by duty. It was the only place he ever allowed himself to cry. That's why, when the city posted a notice about redevelopment plans for Memorial Grove Park, Walter's heart sank. He knew the city's plans didn't include the park, not the way it mattered to him, to the memories it held. He hadn't fought in Vietnam to let that sacred ground be erased for another parking lot or strip mall. The veterans' names deserve better. The decision to preserve his post had been born from something inside Walter Harlan that had been stirred, something that had lain dormant for years. For the first time in decades, he couldn't just let things slide. He couldn't nod politely and fade into the background. Not after what had been proposed. He couldn't ignore it anymore. They had crossed a line. It wasn't just a park redesign, it was an attempt to erase something sacred, something he'd carried with him for so long. The court, the judge, the salute, it all began with that one moment of defiance. It started subtly, almost unnoticeably, like most bad ideas do. It was buried near the bottom of the city council's agenda, easily overlooked. The so-called Clay County Beautification and Modernization Project was sold as an exciting improvement for the community. A new park with brighter lighting, smoother walkways, and a splash pad for kids. Food trucks on weekends, a fresh vision, a beer for the future. The presentation came with smiling families, drone shots of renderings, and the usual catchphrases: revitalization, progress, and modern design. But at the bottom of the proposal, there was one line that stopped Walter cold. Remove aging war memorial to create space for open-use lawn. There was no mention of relocating it, no mention of replacing it, no mention of the names engraved in the stone, names that Walter had visited every week for 20 years. Names that, with every passing season, had begun to fade, one letter at a time. His brothers, his men, some older, some younger. None forgotten, not by him. At first, Walter didn't say a word. He sat quietly through the council meeting. In the back, just another face in the crowd. He listened to the talk of shade structures and QR code history signs. But when the time came for public comment, he stood up. He wasn't angry, just calm, his voice steady when he asked, "What will happen to the memorial?" The response was quick and dismissive. A young staffer, barely old enough to understand, said, "We're considering a digital tribute online. The stone's outdated. It doesn't fit with the modern park experience." That was all Walter needed to hear. The next morning, long before the sun rose, Walter returned to Memorial Grove Park. He dug out his old Army uniform, the one he hadn't worn in decades. It hung loose on him now, the fabric softened by time. His medals, tarnished but real, caught the first rays of light as he sat at the base of the monument. He wrapped a thick steel chain around himself and the stone and locked it shut. Without a word, he dropped the key into the storm drain. By the time the morning rolled around, photos of the scene began circulating on social media. Old man protests demolition. Veteran chained to war monument. Some comments were supportive, mostly from older locals who remembered when the memorial was first unveiled. But many others were cruel. One tweet read, "Delusional Vietnam vet having a meltdown? Let the guy cosplay somewhere else." By noon, city officials arrived, followed by local police. They asked him to leave. He didn't. They warned him he'd be arrested. He nodded, his silence as loud as anything he could have said. When they cut the chain and pulled him to his feet, he didn't resist. He didn't even speak. He just stood there still. As the police cruiser pulled away, someone in the crowd shouted, "Try letting go of the past." That evening, the local news aired a short segment. Vietnam veteran arrested for disrupting park plans. City moves forward with progress despite protests from small vocal group. The anchor's voice was cheerful, as if reporting on a parade. They called him stubborn, out of touch, a relic. But not once did they ask him why he did it. Not once did anyone ask who those names were, the ones etched in the stone. And that, more than the arrest, more than the mocking headlines, was what hurt Walter the most. Because if they could just pave over the dead in silence, what hope was left for the living? The night before his court date, Walter opened a cedar chest that had sat at the foot of his bed for years, gathering dust. It had always been there, a silent witness to the passing of time. When he lifted the lid, the familiar scent of aged wood and tobacco wafted up, as if the chest itself had been waiting. Inside, carefully folded, was his old army uniform. Olive drab, soft from time, but still intact. And resting on top was a small slip of paper, a note in his late wife's handwriting. "You came home. That's all I needed." Walter ran his calloused hand over the fabric, feeling its familiar weight. It felt thinner than he remembered. Or maybe it was just him. Older, leaner. The patches were still sewn tight. The 25th Infantry's insignia, the emblem of the men he'd served with, the ones whose names he would never forget. Walter sat, carefully adjusting his uniform. The Tropic Lightning insignia sat proudly on his shoulder, and the sergeant stripes on his sleeve spoke of battles fought and days spent in the heat of war. His bronze star and purple heart rested in a small box beneath his folded pants, a silent testament to his past. The stiffness in his joints reminded him of the years that had passed. Time had its own rhythm, its own discipline. Getting into the uniform had taken effort. The shirt hung loosely in some areas, but clung tightly in others, and his back didn't stray irritant as it once had. Despite this, he did his best. He buttoned each button with purpose, tucked in the hem, and tightened the belt. As he stood in front of the hallway mirror, the man who looked back was not the 26-year-old who had leapt from helicopters into the steamy jungles of Vietnam. No, this man had silver in his hair and lines etched deeply across his brow. But his eyes, though weary, remained sharp, still carrying the weight of countless names. He reached for his medals and began to polish them gently with a cloth. It didn't matter that they wouldn't shine like they once had. What mattered was the effort, the respect he gave them. He polished his boots too, though their soles had long since thinned. He clipped his nails, combed his hair, and shaved. Not out of vanity, but out of respect. As he worked, his granddaughter Emily peeked into the room. At 16, she was sharp as a tack, never without a thought or an opinion. But when she saw him in uniform, she froze. Her eyes widened, and she whispered, "Grandpa, you look like someone out of a movie." Walter smiled softly. "I look like a man going to court." "I'll come with you," Emily offered. "You shouldn't be alone." He hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Not today, honey," he said, his voice steady. "This one I have to face alone, Picto." She nodded, sensing the weight of his words, understanding something sacred in his tone. Later that night, Walter placed the box of medals beside his cane. He turned off the lights, but sleep didn't come easily. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Inside, memories stirred in his mind. Tomorrow he'd walk into that courtroom, not just as a defendant, but as a soldier keeping a promise he'd made long ago. The next morning, the double doors to the Clay County Courthouse creaked open just past 9 a.m. Walter Harland stepped inside, alone. He moved slowly, the tap of his cane on the tile echoing through the room with each step. His uniform, though pressed and brushed, couldn't hide the weight of the years that hung from his shoulders. His medals clinked softly as he passed the first row of seats where two teenagers exchanged whispers. "Is it Veterans Day already?" one of them asked. "More like cosplay hour," the other replied, pulling out his phone. "Watch this faker get wrecked." He aimed the camera at Walter, already preparing to record. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder. "He's really wearing that? Trying to guilt the court? Looks like he got dressed for a funeral." And in a way, Walter had. Just not the kind they were thinking of. 5 minutes before the proceedings were set to begin, Walter's assigned public defender, Elliot Green, walked in. He glanced at Walter's uniform, his eyebrows furrowing in disapproval. "You wore that?" he asked, not bothering to sit. "I did," Walter replied. Elliot shook his head slightly. "Not ideal, Mr. Harland. Judges prefer remorse, not theatrics. I'd suggest we enter a plea of no contest. Apologize to the court, and maybe I can get you a fine and a few hours of community service." Walter met his gaze evenly. "I won't apologize." Elliot let out a long, frustrated breath. "Then don't expect a miracle," he muttered, walking off to gather his notes while glancing at his watch. When the bailiff called the room to order, the judge hadn't yet entered. The courtroom remained a low hum of chatter. Several people turned to stare at Walter, some from the city's staff, others from the development team behind new park plans. A few held printed presentations, glossy renderings of splash pads and bike lanes. One young woman in a crisp navy suit pointed at Walter and scoffed. "It's sad when they cling like this," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Like history has to be in the way of progress." Before anyone could respond, the city attorney stood up. Margot Kinley was in her 40s, poised and polished, her expression all business. She wore a slate gray suit, sharp and severe, its cool tones echoing the clipped, measured cadence of her voice as she stood to address the bench. "Your Honor," she began, eyes fixed ahead with the poise of someone long accustomed to authority. "The city's case is simple. The defendant willfully disrupted an active construction site, public property designated for redevelopment. He ignored repeated lawful commands issued by officers and physically chained himself to a structure already approved for demolition." Her voice didn't waver, didn't rise. "It wasn't personal, it was policy. We fully acknowledge the service and sacrifice of our nation's veterans, but we cannot allow personal ideology to obstruct progress meant to benefit the larger community." Without turning her head, she cast a glance in Walter's direction. Her expression was void of emotion, her gaze like glass. This wasn't a lawful protest. This was nostalgia, weaponized into disruption. Judge Miriam Langston didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded once and jotted a note with her fountain pen, her face unreadable. Elliot Green stood slowly from the defense table, clutching his notes. His voice was quiet, hesitant. "Your Honor, we request leniency." But the sentence trailed, unanchored, and even he seemed aware of how unconvincing it sounded. He was too green, nervous, underprepared. Walter didn't move. He sat upright, back straight against the chair, hands clasped neatly on the table before him. Each breath he took was steady, deliberate. But beneath the surface, heat crept up the back of his neck like a slow-burning fuse. Not from guilt, from restraint. A kind of pressure that built not in the body, but in the chest, in the places that used to carry orders, burdens, brothers in arms. From the rear of the courtroom, a shrill digital chime broke the air. A cell phone, the same teenager from earlier. He was live streaming again, screen angled toward Walter. "Bet he bought those medals off eBay," the kid said with a snicker. Laughter trickled through the courtroom behind him, soft, stifled, but unmistakable. A ripple of mockery that didn't need volume to sting. Walter didn't flinch. He didn't turn or shift. But somewhere inside, deep and hidden where no court transcript could reach, something recoiled. Not in his joints, in his soul. The ache wasn't new. It was old, worn like the tread on his boots. The kind of ache you get when sacrifice meets ridicule, when silence is mistaken for weakness, and when decades of quiet dignity are reduced to a punchline. And sitting there while the whispers bloomed like mold and the smirks spread like stains, he didn't feel like a veteran. He felt like a spectacle, a sad old man, and not one single person stood up to say otherwise. Judge Miriam Langston had overseen the Clay County Circuit Court for close to 20 years. She was a woman of structure, of precision. Her courtroom ran like a timepiece, no wasted motions, no theatrics. Justice came swiftly, neatly, without unnecessary noise. But that morning, something broke the rhythm. It was during a lull in proceedings. She was reviewing the defendant's file again, not because she needed to, but because something had unsettled her. Not the incident report. She'd read countless just like it. Nor the city's argument, nor the photos, nor the legal motions. No, it was a single line on the last page. Military service. Walter Harland, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 25th Infantry Division, Vietnam. Her pen froze mid-stroke. Charlie Company. That name hadn't crossed her mind in years. She stared at it, unblinking, as if it might disappear if she looked away. A breath caught in her throat. Slowly, almost reverently, she closed the file. Her eyes rose from the pages and drifted across the courtroom, landing on the man seated silently at the defense table. In that instant, he was no longer just the aging protester in an old uniform, no longer the nuisance described in legal briefs. He was someone else, someone who existed in the same shadowed corner of memory where she had long kept a quiet legacy. "Mr. Harland," she said, voice even but newly awake with something unspoken. The murmurs in the courtroom quieted instantly. Heads turned. Even the teenager's phone dipped slightly as he sensed the shift in tone. Walter looked up, his expression careful. He hadn't expected to be addressed directly. "May I ask you something?" she said. He gave a small nod, guarded but respectful. "Yes, ma'am." "Were you deployed with Charlie Company during Operation Iron Wind, June 1969? The question cracked through the air like a whip. The city attorney blinked, visibly confused. Elliot Green looked up, uncertain whether he'd missed a page in the file. Around them, people exchanged glances, puzzled by the deviation from protocol. But Walter understood immediately. His spine straightened without thought, as if summoned by something older than instinct. The words Operation Iron Wind struck a place in him he hadn't touched in years. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I was squad leader then. Second platoon." A pause. "I don't usually talk about it," he added quietly. "No one ever asks." Judge Langston's eyes did not leave his. "My father," she said, her voice soft but firm, "was Captain Benjamin Langston, commanding officer, Charlie Company." Walter's lips parted slightly, like the air had left him. For a second he just breathed, unmoving. "Captain Langston," he repeated, his voice colored by memory. "He was a good man, the kind you follow, no matter what. He never made it back home. That's what the judge said. I was only 3 years old at the time." A thick, reverent silence settled over the courtroom, heavy as a blanket of fresh snow. Not a single whisper rose. Margot Kinley, the city attorney, shifted uncomfortably behind her polished desk. Her earlier smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a blank, uncertain stare. Judge Langston's fingers, barely noticeable to most, trembled slightly as she closed the file again. When she spoke next, her voice had softened. "My mother always said he talked about his men non-stop," the judge recalled, "especially in the days before that final operation. She kept a letter from him. In it, he spoke about one man in particular, a sergeant named Harlon." Walter didn't respond, but the surge of emotion rising inside him was impossible to hide now. His jaw tensed, his eyes blinked slower, as though holding back tears required more effort than any battle he had ever fought. The judge inhaled, steadying herself as she continued. "You were with him at the end." Walter nodded slowly. "We came under fire near a river crossing. He ordered the rest of us to fall back, and he stayed behind to cover our retreat. I saw him go down. We couldn't get to him in time." The judge swallowed hard. Her voice cracked, just once. "Thank you for trying." Still, the room remained quiet. Even the kid in the back with his phone had stopped recording. In that single, fragile moment, everything changed. This was no longer just a legal proceeding. It had transformed into something far more human, a reunion of sorts, between a daughter and a soldier who had been with her father in his final heroic hour. A man who had never sought recognition, who had lived in the shadow of silence, was now being seen for exactly who he had always been. Just as the weight of Judge Langston's revelation began to settle over the room, a small sound broke the stillness. From the back row came the scrape of a chair leg, the measured click of a cane on tile. A figure stood slowly, tall, stooped, moving with the hesitation of old wounds. His face was worn and lined by time. He wore a plain flannel shirt tucked neatly into faded jeans. His silver hair was combed back, and his hand, though trembling slightly, gripped the top of a wooden cane with steady dignity. "Your Honor," the man said. His voice was low, raspy with age, but steady and resolute. "May I speak?" Judge Langston turned toward the bailiff, who stepped forward carefully. After a glance toward Walter and then back to the man, she gave a brief nod. "Please state your name for the court." "EMTT Graves," the man replied. "United States Army, retired, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, Vietnam. I served with Walter Harland." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Even Margot Kinley sat up straighter, blinking like she'd just realized she was in the presence of something she didn't understand. EMTT moved slowly toward the front, each step deliberate, heavy with history. When he reached the stand, he didn't wait to be asked a question. That man, he said, pointing a shaking finger at Walter. He saved my life. 1969, Quang Tri Province, he continued, pausing to draw in a breath that seemed to carry decades of buried memory. We were ambushed. I caught shrapnel in both legs. It couldn't move. Mortar rounds were hitting close, bullets flying everywhere. I thought I was done. I remember praying, begging God not to let me die face down in a rice paddy like that. He looked from the judge to Walter, and then he came back. Through the fire, through everything. Picked me up like dead weight and carried me nearly a mile to the extraction point. Didn't say a word, didn't stop once, just kept going. I blacked out halfway there, woke up on the chopper. He was right beside me, soaked in blood. Some his, some mine. A wave of gasps and whispers swept through the crowd again. Walter didn't move. His jaw remained clenched, his eyes fixed on something far away, something only he could see. He hadn't expected this, not EMTT, not today. The older man reached slowly into his back pocket, pulled out a folded, creased photograph. With care and reverence, he unfolded it and held it up for the room to see. This was taken the day before that mission, he said. Me and Sergeant Harlon, just kids. The photograph, weathered and curled at the edges, showed two young men in dusty fatigues standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a helicopter, their arms draped over each other's backs. Their smiles were wide, too wide for what was waiting ahead. I never forgot, EMTT said, voice thick now. He never told anyone, never asked for anything. No medals, no recognition, never wanted attention. But I'm telling you now. He turned to Walter again, eyes shining. You're a hero, always were. He took a breath, shaking now. You kept your promise, Sarge. After all these years, you still kept it. And just like that, the entire courtroom shifted again. The air that had once been filled with skepticism, judgment, even mockery, now it was thick with reverence. All pretense had vanished. The truth had arrived, not with loud declarations, but with a quiet voice and the weight of memory. The room had fallen into a still, reverent hush. Where once there had been dismissive glances and quiet snickers, there was now nothing but silence, profound, unbroken, and heavy with realization. In that moment, Walter Harland was no longer just an aging man in a faded military uniform. Before their eyes, he became something else entirely. A soldier, a hero, and a living symbol of sacrifices long buried in the corners of memory. Every person in the courtroom had stilled. No one reached for their phone. No one leaned over to whisper. They simply sat, hushed and motionless, as though any movement might shatter the solemnity that had taken hold. Judge Miriam Langston returned to her seat behind the bench, a slim beige folder held carefully in both hands. It was clearly aged, its corners worn, its edges frayed, but the weight it carried was undeniable, surpassing any motion filed or argument spoken. It wasn't part of the original court documents. Everyone knew that. And yet, it now felt more important than everything else that had been said during the entire trial. She tapped the folder gently, then spoke, her voice low and clear, with an unmistakable reverence that seemed to echo off the walls. This file, she said, contains official documents from the Department of the Army. I personally requested Sergeant Harland's full service records during recess. She opened the folder and began to read, her tone unwavering, steady, and laced with deep respect. Sergeant Walter Harland, United States Army, 25th Infantry Division, served 2 combat tours in Vietnam. His military honors include the Silver Star for gallantry in action, the Bronze Star with valor, 2 Purple Hearts for combat injuries, and multiple unit citations recognizing extraordinary service under enemy fire. Her words lingered in the air, each one seeming to hang like a sacred offering. She paused, letting the weight of what she'd read settle over the room. Then she continued. On June 17, 1969, during Operation Iron Wind, Sergeant Harland crossed exposed terrain multiple times under heavy fire to retrieve wounded soldiers. Even after suffering injuries himself, he managed to coordinate an evacuation and establish a defensive perimeter, directly saving the lives of 7 men. Walter kept his eyes locked on a single point ahead of him. He didn't shift, didn't glance around, but to those seated near, it was clear. His shoulders trembled, just faintly. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. Especially not this kind. This wasn't ridicule or dismissal. It was respect. Judge Langston's voice carried on. This court recognizes that Sergeant Harland's actions, both then and now, were born from a deep sense of duty. They were not acts of defiance, but of remembrance. What he did wasn't rebellion. It was reverence. She slowly closed the fold, the finality of that movement ringing louder than any gavel. Then she raised her eyes to meet his. In light of Sergeant Harland's military service, his testimony here, and the broader truths this case has brought into focus, all charges against him are hereby dismissed. There was a collective exhale, as though the entire courtroom had been holding its breath. Still, the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, she added, her voice firm now, this court is submitting a formal judicial recommendation to the Clay County Council that the monument in Memorial Grove Park be designated an official, protected historical site. Its presence does not stand in the way of progress. It is the very ground upon which progress is built. There was no dramatic bang of the gavel, no theatrical moment of closure, just a shared awareness, now spreading through the room like light breaking through clouds. The understanding that something nearly lost had been preserved. The city attorney stood, visibly humbled. Your Honor, he said, the city formally withdraws all complaints, and I offer a personal apology to Mr. Harland. Walter finally looked up. His eyes were rimmed red, but there were no tears. He gave a slow, solemn nod. As the gallery began to empty, one young man, who earlier had been among those smirking, walked toward Walter, hesitant. He stopped in front of him, extended a hand, and said softly, I'm sorry, sir, I didn't know. Walter took the hand, his grip steady, his touch kind. Now you do, son, he replied. That's what matters. And in that quiet exchange, more than in the courtroom victory or the headlines that would follow, the true meaning of the day was revealed. Walter Harland had never truly been forgotten, and neither had the names carved into that memorial stone. Not anymore. By the next morning, the front page of the Clay County Tribune featured a bold headline stretched across the top in heavy capital letters, Courtroom Turned Silent as True Hero Revealed. Below it was a photo, Walter Harland standing tall in his uniform, the judge mid-salute, and an entire courtroom frozen in a collective moment of awe and understanding. The story spread faster than the morning mail. By noon, it had been picked up by local news stations. By nightfall, veteran organizations across the state were sharing it widely. People who had once jeered now looked at Walter with quiet admiration. Strangers gave nods of respect as he walked past. Shop owners offered him free coffee and warm, grateful smiles. A forgotten hero, remembered at last. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, curious, asking who that man was. And for once, the parents had an answer that truly meant something. Within just a week, pressure from the public grew louder, undeniable. The city council, facing mounting voices and backed by Judge Langston's formal recommendation, reversed its controversial redevelopment plan. The memorial would not only be spared, it would be fully restored. A ceremony was quickly arranged. On a clear, brisk Saturday morning, veterans began to arrive, some from neighboring towns, others from distant counties, traveling hours just to be there. Many wore their full-dress uniforms, polished shoes, old medals shining with quiet dignity. Some leaned heavily on walkers or the arms of fellow comrades. There was pride in the air, but there was something deeper too, an aching sense of redemption. At the center of Memorial Grove stood the monument, freshly cleaned, its once faded names now gleaming with new gold leaf. American flags circled the plaza, fluttering gently in the breeze. A new plaque had been mounted at the base, honoring all who had served and those who never stopped standing watch long after the battles ended. The mayor addressed the crowd, followed by the judge. Even the city attorney took the microphone, his voice low with humility, expressing regret and a sincere pledge to do better moving forward. But the crowd wasn't here for them. All eyes were on Walter. When his name was spoken, he moved forward slowly. At each side, offering steady support, were EMTT Graves and his granddaughter, Emily. Walter wore the same uniform he'd worn for years, now freshly pressed, the seams tailored just enough to sharpen its lines. In his hand, he held a small pair of ribbon-cutting scissors. Applause swelled around him, camera flashes lit up the space. But Walter didn't wave or smile. He simply lifted the scissors, firm and deliberate, and sliced through the red ribbon cleanly. The moment the ribbon fell, the plaza erupted into cheers. But Walter still said nothing. Instead, he reached into his pocket and drew out a single red rose. He walked forward, slow and steady, and placed it gently at the foot of the monument. Then in silence, he straightened as much as his old spine would allow, raised his hand in solemn salute, and stood still. And then the crowd quieted, not because they were told, but because they understood. Some moments don't need speeches. Some acts of honor speak loudest in silence. Some heroes never ask for headlines. They only ask to be remembered. The people had once seen an elderly man in a weathered uniform and thought him fragile. They had heard the uneven beat of his cane and assumed weakness. They'd looked at the rusting metals and faded shoulder patches and dismissed him as a relic. But they had been wrong, because sometimes the ones the world is quickest to overlook are the very ones who've borne the heaviest burdens. Sometimes the man with stooped shoulders is the same one who stood tall in the heat of combat, unflinching in the face of death. Sometimes silence doesn't mean surrender. It means memory. Walter Harland never once asked for praise. He didn't seek out attention. Week after week, rain or shine, he simply showed up, keeping quiet watch over names carved in stone. Names that the world had long forgotten, but he never could. Names he had served Besson, laughed with, bled with, names he carried inside him always. In a world that forgets too easily and judges too quickly, his quiet defiance was never about rebellion. It was about duty, about honor, about a sacred promise made long ago to never let them be erased. And maybe, just maybe, it took a courtroom full of skeptics and a single unwavering salute to remind all of us. Not every hero wears a cape. Not every veteran shouts to be heard. But they never forget the names. Have you ever misjudged someone because of how they looked? Ever passed by someone small and quiet, unaware they once stood for something so much greater? Think about that. And if someone like that comes to mind, someone humble, overlooked, who made a difference, who stood their post when no one else did, tell their story. Because stories like Walter's deserve to be known. And sometimes the smallest salute carries the weight of a grateful nation. Sometimes the man we so easily call a relic was once the one who saved us all.